So while this is all going on in the United States, as we get into the 70s and the 80s, while the Christian coalition, the religious right, is coming up, the Soviet Union is coming down. Since the 1940s, the USSR had been engaged in a Cold War with the United States. Essentially, it was the proliferation of nuclear weapons that was kind of, each side was developing strategies to go against the other, but with the mutually assured possibility of destruction, it was kept a Cold War, in that they're stockpiling weapons, but nobody wants to launch them first, because if we would launch against the Soviet Union, before the missiles would get there, the Soviet Union would launch their missiles and everybody would be dead. Right? And so there's this kind of Cold War. Right? You're going against the other person, but you're not actually physically fighting. But in some places, there were kind of hot expressions of this Cold War, in places like Korea and Vietnam, where Korea and Vietnam kind of become these surrogates for an actual war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Even in Afghanistan, where the Soviets were trying to get into Afghanistan, and so we helped the Taliban, or the forerunners of the Taliban, to go against the Soviets because they were going against the Soviets, and then 30 years later we find ourselves at war with the very people that we'd supported because they had been against the USSR. For the Soviet Union especially, this proliferation of weapons, this attempt to keep up with the United States, ultimately put them in a very difficult economic and cultural situation. And so ultimately it's the economics here that brings the Soviet Union down. But that has an impact on Christianity as well in the Soviet Union, and what would eventually become countries like Russia, the Ukraine, other places like that. When Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the USSR, essentially the leader, in the 1980s, he began pushing two policies, glasnost and perestroika. Essentially, glasnost means transparency, perestroika means restructuring. And so it was an effort to kind of try and save the Soviet Union out of these crippling economic situations. But the damage was already done. And by the early 1990s, the Soviet Union had fallen, and after that it was a domino effect. Many of the communist countries that became communist after World War II suddenly found their dictators overthrown. And I remember living through this. And it was like every couple of days, every couple of months, you were hearing of these communist countries falling, where the people would rise up and throw individuals out of power. One country assassinated their leaders on Christmas Day. And so there's this continual fall of communism in Europe. And within all of this, the Orthodox Church is entwined and then also suffers some impact from it. A lot of the push coming from the people to end communism was often very integrated with the Orthodox Church. It was their faith that often supported them through communism and then often supported them in the aftermath. And Gonzalez talks about this to some extent as well. And so the Orthodox Church in these countries had often been in hiding. In the late 80s and early 90s, it's becoming more visible. With the fall of communism, however, came a large number of missionaries. And they were bringing other forms of Catholicism, or not other forms of Christianity, I should say. Catholicism, Protestant versions. In fact, several of our faculty, the parents of several of our students here, have served as missionaries to a variety of these places after the fall of the Soviet Union. Essentially, what Russia and other countries found out of the breakup of the Soviet Union was that they had a moral crisis. That there was so much corruption in the government even prior to the fall of communism, but especially after a lot of these corrupt groups seized power or were influencing a lot of things in government. And so a lot of the leaders of these countries turned to Christian groups, especially in the United States, to help them solve this problem. Reaching out and saying, help us figure out what to do to make our people moral. They taught atheism so well, and yet here were people that didn't have moral views. And so all sorts of things happened, and Christianity was called upon to try and salvage some of the morality of the Russian and Eastern European people. And then what we also saw through the 90s was a lot of violence in a lot of those Eastern European countries, sometimes between Christians, sometimes between Christians and Muslims, over who's going to be in charge of these countries. There was at one point a country called Czechoslovakia, which was made up of a variety of religious groups, but it became this Christians and Muslims committing atrocities on each other, eventually breaking up into, I think it was 3 countries, including the Czech Republic. And so, there's this kind of vacuum that develops in Eastern Europe and Russia. We're still kind of seeing the after effects even today. In 2012, when he was running for the presidency, Mitt Romney, a Mormon, was asked who he thought was the greatest enemy of the United States, current 2012, and he said Russia. And he was jeered a lot for that because he was saying Russia. And what we're seeing now is that a lot of the attitudes that existed in the pre-fall period are starting to be evidenced specifically among the leadership at this time in Russia. For some reason, I forgot his name. Vladimir Putin, who had been involved in the KGB and some other organizations in the Soviet Union. He's kind of extending his grasp into the Ukraine. He's flying missions over some American-controlled areas, and so there's kind of this. Are we seeing this attempt to kind of rebuild the Soviet Union? And so that'll be another thing here as well in the future. We'll see whether how that will all fit out, how that will all work out, and what impact Christianity will have, or what impact that will have on Christianity. Questions about the fall of the Soviet Union? I guess that's more of a 21st century thing we've been talking about. Let's turn then to talk about culture and society. And a couple of things here to think about. We're going to kind of pick up the concern about social activism we talk about with evangelicalism, and we talk about it in some other groups. We're going to talk about civil rights, some other elements of cultural change in the West in the 1900s, but certainly by no means all of the things that we could say about the 20th century. I'm going to start off by talking about the social gospel. Think back to when we were talking about the 19th century, and towards the end of the 19th century, you have this rise of immigration, people coming from all over to the United States, and that bringing with them or with immigration, you have a rise of all sorts of different challenges. And so immigrants and lower classes often faced a lot of difficulties, especially in urban areas of the United States, in the cities. And that led some Christians to be concerned about what could be done to help the situation. And like the progressive evangelicals of the late 1900s, in the early 20th century, many of these more liberal Christians were interested in applying Christianity to social justice issues. Essentially, industrialization and urbanization have provided situations where the rich were taking advantage of the poor. And by the 20th century, what we might call a social gospel was apparent. Right? This message of Christianity for the situations of the time. One of the key figures, though certainly not the first and certainly not the only one of the key figures in this social gospel was a preacher named Walter Rauschenbusch. He becomes a Baptist minister in an area of New York known as Hell's Kitchen, a very poor area in Manhattan. And at the time, a place where there were a lot of German immigrants, and that was Rauschenbusch's background. And so he becomes very concerned about the poverty that these German immigrants are living in, and wants to know what he can do about it. You know, ultimately, Rauschenbusch has been influenced by the higher criticism, what we talked about with the doctrine of the 19th century, some of the liberal theology of that, and so we can call him a liberal Protestant. And out of that comes this socially innovative understanding of Christianity. Christians, Rauschenbusch believed, were expected to transform society into the kingdom of God. And so he has an idea about the kingdom of God and what it looks like. But the way that happens for Rauschenbusch isn't through conversion of individuals, but through social changes in politics, changes in culture. And so Rauschenbusch isn't concerned about individual salvation like evangelicals might be. In fact, he adopted a socialist outlook on a lot of society, but without the atheism that many socialists included. Because ultimately he's concerned about the conditions of the working people and what's the best way to help them. In 1907, he publishes Christianity and the Social Crisis, one of his first books. Essentially, in this book, he argued that human beings had conquered nature, but had not conquered themselves. And so there was a need for human beings to work against their nature. Ultimately, he believed biblical religion was about transforming human society. But Christians had failed at this. And so even he's kind of looking at the problems in society in the early 20th century and saying it's not too late for Christians to transform society for the better. He kind of systematizes his thoughts about this better society and viewing what that would look like through his work that he releases 3 years later, Theology for the Social Gospel. Ultimately in it, Rauschenbusch is concerned about social salvation. He wants to save the social order, not as much about individual souls. Ultimately, says Rauschenbusch, social problems are religious problems. And so, conservative evangelicals would have made a distinction between social problems and religious problems. But Rauschenbusch felt these things were united. They weren't irreligious problems. But like other liberal Protestants of the time, he was open to higher criticism. He was open to Darwinian approaches to the development of human beings, and felt that evolution was a modern form of providence. Right? That evolution was a scientific way to talk about how God providentially worked. Now, ultimately, he's not sold completely on Darwin. He's not saying, man and apes had a common ancestor or anything like that. But what he does have here is really idealistic outlook on human progress. That we're a really kind of optimistic view of human nature. Society was the kingdom of evil. And in the kingdom of evil, selfishness reigns and is very evident. And so, the social gospel would be about turning society into the kingdom of God. And working against selfishness, working for other people. And what you see with Rauschenbusch is a very intense focus on this life. And so he doesn't really talk too much about the afterlife, and felt that a lot of the Christian message that focused on the afterlife, right, stop sinning so you can go to heaven, or you can escape hell, was more of teaching the afterlife as an escape from this world, when Rauschenbusch felt we really need to focus the Christian message on this world, not see the afterlife as an escape. And so this kind of liberal approach to society and social order. Something similar is taking place in Catholicism as well.